Battle of Britain was in fact won some years before by a decision to build chain homes and to develop the very effective communication system between it and fighting.
Did you know that during World War II, some Allied bombers defeated enemy aircraft defenses not just with cutting-edge technology, but by literally throwing bottles out of their planes? Yes, you heard that right. While the war was filled with dramatic air battles, intense ground warfare, and secret missions, there were also moments of downright bizarre ingenuity. Welcome to another episode where we dive into the lesser-known stories of World War II. And today, we're talking about one of the weirdest tricks in the book, bombers tossing bottles to confuse the enemy. Why on earth would military pilots trained for precision and tactics resort to what sounds like a pub brawl tactic? Well, believe it or not, this odd countermeasure was actually part of a much larger strategy to outsmart Axis forces and make sure the bombers made it home alive. Curious yet? Let's take a closer look. During World War II, detecting enemy planes wasn't as easy as flipping on a radar screen like in modern times. In fact, radar technology was still in its infancy, and spotting an incoming plane was an incredibly complex task. On one side of the battlefield, the Allies and the Axis powers were locked in a high-stakes game of technological cat and mouse, racing to develop better radar systems and countermeasures to gain air superiority. The Germans, known for their technical prowess, had some of the most advanced radar systems of the time. Their radar could detect planes from miles away, in all kinds of weather, and even at night. These systems gave them a significant edge in defending against Allied bombing raids, which targeted crucial industrial centers. Meanwhile, Japan and Italy relied more on human operators, using massive sound locators, giant metal ears pointed skyward, to listen for approaching planes. But while the Axis had their strengths, the Allies weren't sitting idly by. The British, in particular, pushed radar technology to its limits with their chain home system, an early warning radar network that helped intercept enemy bombers before they even crossed the English Channel. As the war progressed, the Allies developed increasingly sophisticated radar systems and, more importantly, ways to neutralize Axis detection methods. It was a race where both sides were constantly trying to outsneak the other. Imagine radar operators frantically twisting knobs, wondering if they were tracking an enemy bomber or just a particularly large flock of birds. In short, the radar race was about more than just detecting planes. It was about survival. But as the war dragged on, the need for more creative, sometimes downright wacky countermeasures became a crucial part of the bomber's toolkit. So, what did bombers do when they knew the enemy had them locked on radar? Well, it wasn't just about evasive flying or fancy maneuvers. Pilots had an arsenal of countermeasures to confuse the enemy's detection systems. Some were high-tech for the time, and others were, well, a bit more creative. The goal was simple: trick the enemy radar, sound locators, and spotlights to avoid getting shot out of the sky. One of the most effective countermeasures was radio frequency jamming. This involved sending out signals that interfered with the enemy's radar, causing it to display misleading information. To the Axis radar operators, it might have looked like there were multiple planes or none at all. This confusion could make it impossible for anti-aircraft gunners to lock onto their target. You could say these jammers were the early World War II equivalent of a Wi-Fi outage, leaving the enemy radar operators scratching their heads and hitting the radar with a wrench. But jamming wasn't always enough. The Royal Air Force, RAF, came up with another ingenious solution: chaff. Chaff was made of thin strips of aluminum or even literal straw, and when dropped in large quantities from bombers, it would create a cloud of radar reflections. From the ground, it looked like an entire squadron of planes was in the sky, when in reality, the bombers were flying away quietly in the other direction. It was like setting off a smoke bomb in a magic show, except the audience had anti-aircraft guns. Look up in the sky. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's just a bunch of straw confusing the heck out of those poor radar operators. Meanwhile, sound locators, those giant metal ears, were equally vulnerable to tricks. Bombers learned to manipulate their engine sounds, either by cutting the throttle to glide silently or revving their engines erratically, making it impossible for the sound locators to get an accurate reading. Each of these methods was designed with one thing in mind: survival. In the chaotic skies over Europe and the Pacific, anything that gave bombers a chance to get through the deadly gauntlet of anti-aircraft defenses was worth a shot. And while some of these countermeasures were sophisticated, others, well, let's just say they were involved in some rather unusual approaches. Now let's talk about the truly bizarre tactics. The Allied bombers didn't just rely on advanced tech, they also used some unexpected methods to throw off the enemy. We've already mentioned chaff, those strips of aluminum that confused radar operators, but things got even weirder from there. Enter bottles. Yes, you heard that right. Allied bombers resorted to literally throwing bottles out of their planes. This wasn't some act of frustration or a bizarre mid-air recycling program. No, this was an actual tactic used to mess with Axis sound locators. You see, when these bottles fell from the bombers, they made a whistling sound as they tumbled through the air. This whistle was enough to fool the sound locators into thinking a plane was approaching, or at least create enough confusion to give the bomber time to slip through unnoticed. When your plane's loaded with explosives, but you find yourself saying, you know what we need right now? Some empty bottles. Imagine the confusion on the ground. Is that a bomber or the world's weirdest wind chime? But it wasn't just bottles. In some cases, actual straw was used as a distraction. While chaff was primarily made of aluminum strips, there were also reports of bombers using straw to create similar radar confusion. In a time when every resource was valuable, it's safe to say the Allies were getting a little desperate or just wildly creative. And here's the best part. These bizarre tactics worked. Bombers in the Pacific reported that when they tossed bottles near enemy sound locators, the anti-aircraft crews stopped firing for a couple of minutes, seemingly baffled by the sudden noise. 2 minutes might not sound like much, but in the intense heat of battle, it could make all the difference between life and death. Picture the scene where Axis anti-craft crews hear a whistle, panic, and think, well, that's it, the planes are here, time to turn off the spotlights and hope for the best. Meanwhile, the bomber pilots are probably chuckling. Thanks, Bottle, you've saved the day. In the end, whether it was sophisticated jamming or simply throwing things out of a window, these quirky countermeasures helped ensure the success of Allied bombing raids. They may sound strange, but in a war where survival depended on quick thinking and improvisation, even the humble Bottle had its moment of glory. When it comes to World War II, most people picture dogfights, bomb raids, and powerful radar systems. But for the Axis powers, particularly Japan and Italy, radar wasn't always available or reliable. So they turned to a different, more low-tech solution: giant sound locators. These massive devices, resembling oversized stethoscopes, were designed to listen for the sound of approaching aircraft engines. The idea was simple: point the metal ears at the sky, detect the sound of bomber engines, and calculate their position and altitude. But here's the thing about sound locators: they had one big flaw. They were easily fooled by creative pilots. The Allies quickly figured out that if they adjusted their engine noise, they could throw the sound locators into complete disarray. One common tactic was for bombers to cut their engines mid-flight, allowing them to glide silently for short periods. With no engine sound to pick up, the locators would miss the planes entirely. It was like hitting the mute button on the biggest sound system the Axis had. Imagine the poor sound locator operator listening intently, and suddenly, nothing. Did they disappear, or did I just go deaf? Another method was to rev the engines irregularly, causing the sound locators to misjudge the speed and direction of the planes. By making unpredictable engine noises, bombers could trick the Axis into thinking the planes were in a completely different location. But nothing takes the cake quite like the bottle trick. Allied bombers would literally toss bottles out of their planes to confuse sound locators. As these bottles plummeted, they made a high-pitched whistling sound, loud enough to mimic a falling bomb or incoming plane. The operators, hearing this strange noise, would stop tracking the real planes for a few crucial moments. Throwing bottles to distract the enemy? You'd think they were having a mid-flight party. Hey, pass me another bottle. This one's going straight for that sound locator. These tricks worked surprisingly well. In fact, reports from Pacific campaign bombers revealed that Japanese anti-aircraft crews would stop firing and even turn off their spotlights for 2 minutes whenever they heard the whistling bottles. In those few moments of confusion, the bombers had a chance to escape, leaving the sound locators scratching their heads, or, more accurately, their giant metal ears. If fooling sound locators wasn't enough, Allied bombers also had to contend with spotlights, powerful beams of light used to track aircraft flying at night. Once an enemy plane was illuminated by these spotlights, it became an easy target for anti-aircraft gunners. So, how did the bombers avoid becoming sitting ducks? Well, they had a few clever tricks up their sleeves. The most common method was to paint the undersides of bombers in matte black, a strategy known as night camouflage. With this non-reflective paint, bombers became nearly invisible against the dark sky. Even when a spotlight was aimed directly at them, it was the equivalent of wearing an all-black outfit to sneak into a movie theater, only with much higher stakes. The light wouldn't bounce off the plane's surface, making it hard for spotlights to get a clear lock. It's like trying to find your friend in a dark room, except your friend is a 70-foot-long bomber and you're holding a flashlight. But that wasn't the only trick. Spotlights themselves were vulnerable to direct attacks. In the Pacific Theater, Allied bombers equipped with 50-caliber Browning machine guns would sometimes fire at the spotlights themselves. Since the spotlights revealed the enemy's location, bombers would rain down gunfire, forcing the Japanese crews to turn off the lights to avoid being hit. No spotlight? No problem. It's like the world's most intense game of tag. If they saw you, you just tag them back with bullets. Another sneaky tactic involved flying at higher altitudes. While spotlights were powerful, their range was limited. By flying higher than the spotlights could reach, bombers could slip by undetected, relying on their dark camouflage and speed. And when that wasn't an option, the bombers could rely on chafing those shiny strips of aluminum we mentioned earlier. By dropping chaff, bombers created false radar echoes, confusing the radar systems that guided the spotlights, and making it nearly impossible for the lights to find them. These methods weren't just about dodging a few beams of light. They were life-saving strategies. Avoiding the spotlights meant dodging anti-aircraft fire and staying out of the enemy's sights, giving Allied bombers a better chance of completing their missions and returning home. From cutting-edge technology to the downright bizarre, the countermeasures used by Allied bombers during World War II were as creative as they were effective. Whether it was jamming enemy radar, dropping chaff to create radar confusion, or simply throwing bottles out of the window, these tactics helped bombers survive the dangerous skies. What might sound like a mix of spy gadgets and barroom antics, straw, bottles, painted bombers, and jamming frequencies were actually life or death strategies. Each countermeasure, no matter how strange, played a crucial role in ensuring the success of Allied bombing missions, and ultimately, the defeat of the Axis powers. So next time someone tells you that throwing bottles is a bad idea, just remind them it helped win a world war. In the end, these strange and innovative countermeasures are a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. When survival was on the line, anything that could confuse the enemy was fair game, even if it meant tossing a bottle or two. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more weird and wonderful stories from World War II.